Pankalan Prison Bun, located in the middle of a dense jungle, was known not only for its worn-out architecture, but also for the inhumane conditions to which its inmates were subjected. With its high, worn-out walls, the prison stood as a symbol of repression and power. The day had started like any other, but that morning a new prisoner arrived at the compound. Rizky, a young man of just 16 who had been arrested for a minor crime in Jakarta. His mother, Siti, had traveled thousands of miles to see him, filled with anxiety and fear. The image of her son, with his innocent eyes and messy hair, tore at her heart. It was the first time Rizky had faced the harshness of a prison environment, and his only hope was that his mother could provide him with some comfort. However, this country's prison system had other rules. Officer Enda, a feisty, cold-eyed woman, was in charge of the prison wing. From her first day on the police force, she had made oppression and abuse her modus operandi. She was known for her ironclad discipline and intimidating nature, but few knew of her dark secret that made her even more dangerous. Her corrupt relationship with certain inmates, which gave her absolute control over them. She, along with her partner Ratna, had drawn up a Machiavellian plan that not only involved maintaining order in the prison, but also enjoying the power that their position gave them. Ratna was Enda's right-hand woman, a female accomplice who shared his ambitions. Together, the two policewomen established a regime based on fear, but also on favoritism. Rizky would become her target of desire. Before arriving in prison, Rizky had been a promising young man. His mother had always dreamed of seeing him finish his studies and make a name for himself in the world. A change of circumstances and wrong decisions led him to find himself in the darkest place of his life. After several days in the dungeon, the climate of iniquity begins to pave the way to his tragic destiny. Meanwhile, Siti tried to obtain information about her son, but Enda's words chilled her. "Your son will be fine, ma'am," the officer said with a sardonic smile, hiding the true intentions of her dealings with the young man. "But you cannot see him now. There are procedures to follow." The woman, confident in the integrity of the system, felt helpless in the face of the police's refusal, forcing her to leave the prison with a heavy heart, unaware that Rizky was already caught in a web of manipulation and abuse. Rizky spent his days in a small tent, a space shared with other inmates. The routine was brutal. Days and nights indistinguishable, hours filled with suffering and despair. Although his mother had promised to return, with each passing day he felt her words fade away. In prison, there was no place for love or compassion. Enda, realizing that Rizky had a strong personality and a rebellious spark, decided that he would be a good example to subdue. It was a strategy of control. He selected isolated young men who still had a shred of resistance and turned them into his plaything. When he saw him, he couldn't help but feel that Rizky might be more than just a prisoner. He might be a projection of his own authority. As the days passed, Rizky began to experience distinctive treatment. His surroundings changed. He was not treated like everyone else. He was allowed to go outside for fresh air more often and had access to better quality food. The other prisoners looked at him enviously. "Why him?" they murmured amongst themselves, sensing that tensions were growing by the day. What Rizky didn't know was that this attention was a double-edged sword. One afternoon, while cleaning the yard, she found Enda waiting. The officer approached him with an unsettling smile. "Rizky, you have proven to be a good boy. You should take a look at your situation." The insinuations were subtle, but their meaning was clear. Enda was interested in more than just good behavior. Through several encounters, the tension between them increased. Rizky felt a strange attraction. There was something captivating about Enda's authority, yet at the same time he was horrified by it. Enda was quick to let him know that he had the power to make his situation in prison better or worse. "If you cooperate, I can help you," he told him, his eyes shining with malice. A mixture of fear and curiosity filled him as he realized that he was walking a dangerous balance. As Rizky struggled with the confusion of his feelings, Ratna's constant presence made the atmosphere even more unsettling. Enda's partner was the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. She handled information and conversations between the prisoners, and was always aware of Rizky's movements. The complicity between the two officers was evident. Ratna looked at Rizky with a mixture of contempt and desire, enjoying the spectacle that unfolded. Rizky's condition deteriorated both psychologically and physically. The tension in the cell and the screams of other prisoners became his grim normality. However, what was happening behind the closed doors of the police station was a dark secret. Enda began taking Rizky to his office, where at first they limited themselves to casual chats, but soon they realized that the physical attraction was undeniable. The power game turned into something more intimate. In a dark corner of the prison, where shadows hid unspeakable truths, Risky found himself trapped between his fears and desires. This place, a cell for most, became the stage for a toxic relationship that, although not explicitly, was transformed into something more than a simple exchange of favors between guard and prisoner. The line that separated right from wrong began to blur, and Risky felt trapped in a labyrinth of confusion. From his cell, the days slipped by, each one a repetition of humiliation and salvation. He recalled moments of his life in freedom, when he walked the streets of Jakarta, the vibrant aromas of the market and the laughter with his friends. All that seemed distant, almost surreal, and now his reality was a game of domination and fervor. All he had left were memories and the hope of a different future. By the end of Part 1, the situation is turning critical. As Risky intensely navigated his emotions and his new relationship with Enda, tensions between them grew. The officer was more than willing to cross lines no guard should, and Risky found himself caught in a web of dangerous desire. Phrases like, "This is just a game," repeated themselves in their minds, as the spiral continued downward. Pangkalan prison bun. The clanking of bars, the piercing screams, and the musty smell permeated the air. Although Risky was slowly becoming accustomed to the brutality of prison, his life within those walls became increasingly complicated as his relationship with Officer Enda intensified. The line between duty and abuse continued to blur, and in this hostile environment, moments of closeness turned into a loaded gun. Enda, aware of the power she held over Risky, knew she could manipulate him at will. Every meeting between the two became a game of seduction and domination. Their first time alone in the service office, a bare room with a small barred window, marked the beginning of a series of moments filled with tension and danger. That day, as the sound of chains rattled behind them, the officer approached Risky, her gaze a flash of repressed desire. "Risky," she murmured softly, "your behavior has been exemplary, more so than many of the others here. There's something special about you." That sentence resonated in his heart. Although he knew it was all a power play, he couldn't help but feel flattered, even loved. At the gates of hell, this was his small salvation. However, his illusion became a trap, and Risky would soon understand that he couldn't escape it. As the weeks passed, Enda's visits to his cell became more and more frequent. She began taking him into private spaces, where he felt as if he were living a vivid, distorted dream. Risky's fervent curiosity and emotional isolation made him vulnerable to the officer's overtures. One night, as Enda talked to him about life outside prison, Risky realized that in that dark room he was not only eager to get out, but had also begun to emotionally depend on the officer. She told him stories of her childhood, of how she had chosen to become a police officer, and what she had sacrificed for it. With each confession, Risky felt less like a prisoner and more like the object of something deeper. The situation became even more delicate when, one night, Enda dropped her boss facade and showed herself vulnerable. Her eyes, normally full of determination, were clouded with a sadness that surprised Risky. "You can't imagine how difficult it is to be here, in this prison, away from my family," she confessed. That moment of openness made the connection between them become more intense and dangerous. Risky, feeling the need to comfort her, took her hand. "You are not alone, I know what pain is," he said, feeling bold. In that instant, the barriers and fear vanished. The words were a bridge to an intimacy they could no longer ignore. Suddenly, their interactions began to take on a new charge. One afternoon, as the sun set and shadows danced on the walls, Enda led him into a small office at the back of the prison. It was empty and quiet, with a single window facing the corridor. "Here, we have more privacy," she whispered, her words enveloping Risky in a mix of anticipation and fear. The intensity of those moments together became unimaginable. Despite the darkness of their relationship, Risky felt alive in a way he hadn't experienced before. The furtive smiles, the casual touches of their hands, every glance became a game of seduction. However, that intimacy was a double-edged sword. While Risky discovered a connection he had never imagined, he also delved deeper into an abyss from which he might not be able to escape. Enda took him on walks through the inner space of the prison, where he felt controlled, but at the same time, deceptively protected. But tensions grew. Their encounters were fraught with imminent danger, and Risky began to realize that Enda's desire was not pure passion. There was a dark side to his attraction. The police felt powerful while manipulating him, and Risky, despite his resistance, felt trapped in his search for their acceptance. As their relationship grew stronger, Ratna began to suspect her partner's intentions. She had noticed Enda's special attention to Risky, and her astute mind began to spin a web of disturbing thoughts. Could it be that the officer was seeking more than just control? Enda's partner was the only one who, behind the facade of authority, perceived the fragility of the game that was being played. One day, Ratna decided to confront Enda. "What's going on between you and the prisoner?" "Don't think I don't notice what's going on," he said, while looking at her with disdain. "We can't let this become a scandal. We need to keep our image under control." Enda, enraged, responded with a nervous laugh. "Relax. I'm just handling the situation. This young man has something special, and I'm going to take advantage of it." The power dynamics were shifting. As Risky became more immersed in the tangled web of passions, Enda felt increasingly insecure. The thrill of the game kept her on her toes, but on the other hand, the fear that their relationship might be discovered became disturbing. A prisoner of her own desire, she clung to her control, convincing herself that what she was doing was for the good of both of them. Meanwhile, Risky struggled to find his way. Days of intense feelings turned into nights of restlessness. Most of the prisoners felt he was privileged, looking down on him with resentment, but Risky felt alone within his bubble of privilege. Enda's authority over him made him feel used. Confusion about his place in the officer's heart left him perplexed. One night, as he lay in his bunk, strongly connected to his surroundings despite his status as a recluse and knowing that something was going to change, Risky decided that he needed to change the cards in the game. He had to find a way out of this dangerous game. What would happen if he rebelled against his desire? The idea of resisting Enda formed in his mind, incubating the hope that he could regain his freedom. Since then, Risky began to be more subtle in his actions. Instead of letting himself be completely carried away by the attraction he felt, he decided to distance himself emotionally from Enda. He began to talk to her less and to avoid her gaze. This resistance surprised Enda, who was not used to her toys turning their backs on her. The change brought with it a breath of fresh air. However, the officer was determined to maintain her control at all costs. When Enda saw Risky distancing himself, her counterattack was fierce. She decided to make an example of him. Manipulation turned to threats. "Don't forget that I have the power here, Risky," she warned him one afternoon, as she looked at him with a ray of fury and longing mixed together. "If you thought you could easily get away from me, you're wrong." Enda's words echoed in his mind like a terrifying echo. He knew that things would never be the same again. But what he didn't know was that this relationship would not only lead to his downfall, but would also be a defining story that would set in motion a cycle of betrayal and violence. As Risky struggled with his resistance, the other prisoners began to notice the growing tension between him and Enda. The atmosphere in the prison became electric and fragile. Rumors increased, and the glances between the prisoners were no longer just jealousy. They began to turn into a set of warnings. "He is a walking dead," one of the older men said in whispers. "No matter how much he thinks he can resist, the officer will not let him go just like that." The days grew darker and darker. The pressure each of them exerted on Risky and his relationship with Enda became palpable. As desire and manipulation intertwined, the shadow of a tragic end loomed ever larger over them. Meanwhile, deep inside, a spark of resistance was awakening in the young prisoner. As the culmination of the destructive relationship approached, Risky could not understand that his attempt to free himself from Enda's clutches would lead him into an inevitable conflict, one that could only have a painful outcome. Pankalan Prison Bun had become unbreathable, fraught with tension and desperation. The relationship between Risky and Officer Enda, which had begun as a game of power and seduction, had now transformed into a fight for survival. Every day it felt more like a battle between Risky's resistance and the absolute control Enda sought to exert over him and, by extension, over all the prisoners. The nights became endless evenings of anguish, where Risky reflected on his situation. The pressure of being a prisoner under the rule of Enda, who did not seem willing to relinquish her control, consumed him. A fog of despair enveloped him. However, the flame of resistance flickered within him. There were times when he wondered if there was any chance of breaking free not only from the physical prison, but also from the emotional yoke that Enda had imposed on his life. One day, after an intense argument with Enda, Risky decided he could no longer continue like this. In his mind, the idea of resisting, even at the risk of his life, was better than remaining a pawn in the officer's dangerous power game. As he walked back to his cell, his resolve grew. "I can't just be an object of her desire. he muttered to himself, as if the words could infuse him with the courage he needed. Finally, his decision was made. He gathered other prisoners together to discuss their common experiences and how they could fight against the oppression of Enda and the prison administration. At night, on their modest straw mattresses, they would engage in fervent discussions about the possibility of an uprising. Risky often spoke of the importance of unity, of how the strength of several could challenge the authority of the system. Yet there was a lurking fear in their hearts. This prison was not a place where dissent was allowed, and the consequences of rising up against Enda and his staff could be disastrous. That night, everything seemed to be against them. The sound of silence in the prison was interrupted by the restless murmur of prisoners preparing to perform in the shadows. Risky motivated them even more. His passion ignited with every word he spoke. "We are not fighting just for ourselves. We are fighting so that no one else has to live through this suffering," he said, his eyes shining with a fervor that the darkness could not extinguish. With the uprising taking shape, the atmosphere became electric. Every plan, every attempt at organization, gave them a renewed sense of purpose. The last conversation with Enda echoed in their minds, and the feeling of defiance crept into their veins. Yet the glimmer of hope was accompanied by the shadow of fear. Risky knew that the path they had chosen was dangerous, that any future confrontation could end in lost lives. Still, he could not ignore the force that drove him to fight. The need to be free, to throw off the shackles that bound him not only physically, but also emotionally, drove him forward. The day of the uprising arrived. The prison, normally filled with echoes of despair, now reverberated with cries for freedom. The prisoners, their hearts pounding, gathered in the central courtyard, where an old tree stood as a silent witness to their suffering. Risky, at the front, raised his arms, seeking the courage he had awakened in his comrades. "Today we are not just prisoners. Today we are men and women ready to fight for our freedom." The words echoed in the air. The crowd, animated by their fervor, began to shout in unity. Risky knew that, no matter the consequences, this was the time to act. Enda's response, however, was swift and brutal. Like a dark bolt of lightning in a storm, she arrived in the yard with a group of armed officers. "Stop! You don't know what you're doing!" Her voice rang out with authority. But her words could not dampen the prisoners' determination. What had begun as a spark of hope now burned into a flame of revolt. The prisoners surged forward, the air filled with a mix of screams and confusion. Enda's forces, feeling outnumbered, began to draw their clubs, attacking the prisoners in a desperate attempt to re-establish control. Risky felt a tingle of adrenaline. He stepped forward, pushing other prisoners into a defensive line. "Do not retreat," he shouted, his voice cutting through the clamor of chaos. "Fight for us." But even as he spoke, a wave of terror washed over him as a first blow landed nearby, signaling the start of the violence. The sound of combat filled the air. Prisoners, fighting hand to hand, used anything they could find as weapons. Risky, fists clenched and heart pounding, found himself in the midst of the din, sensing danger closer than he had ever imagined. As he defended himself from an officer, he glimpsed Enda in the distance, his face exuding rage and control. The uproar grew, and Risky was aware that every blow and every scream was a tangible reminder of his fight for freedom. However, his fight would soon turn into a nightmare. In a moment of distraction, while he was trying to help a fallen comrade, an officer lunged at him, delivering a brutal blow that sent him reeling. There was no time to process the pain. Suddenly, a series of blood-curdling screams echoed around them as some prisoners collapsed, struck by the relentless violence. The tension of the moment escalated, and an unexpected blow to Risky brought him to the ground. With a growing burn in his chest, he realized that the blow was not just physical. It was symbolic of the battle that had begun with hope and was now turning grim and terrifying. As the confrontation escalated, Risky struggled to get up, his efforts hampered by the body of a comrade lying limp beside him. Despair began to set in at his heart. "I can't let it end like this," he mused. Every blow he received and every moan that echoed around him were reminders that the fight for freedom was costing more than they had anticipated. Turning, he found Enda staring at him from a distance. His eyes burned with fury and despair. "You cannot beat me, Risky. You can never be free." His voice echoed ominously in the tumultuous battle. And in that gaze, Risky saw something he had never anticipated. This was not just a power struggle, but a struggle for control of hope. His body tired and his senses heightened by adrenaline, he regained some strength. "I won't let you control me," "I'm fighting for my life," he screamed, feeling the words stir something deep within him. But immediately, the violence surrounding him was interrupted by a stabbing pain in his side. Risky collapsed, gasping for air, unable to fully process what had happened. The officer's blow had been more powerful than he had anticipated. He reached to his side and felt the wetness of blood soaking into his shirt. The struggle to stay upright became increasingly difficult. Confusion and uncertainty filled his senses as his vision blurred. "Risky, no. Don't give up," he heard someone shout, but the words slowly faded into the echoes of violence and chaos around him. Everyone was fighting, but Risky knew his time was running out. As darkness engulfed him and the pain intensified, he realized the stark truth. He had risked everything for freedom, but the liberation he had aspired to now seemed like a distant, unattainable dream. As his comrades pressed forward, fighting bravely, he felt increasingly helpless. Was it all for nothing? He asked himself in his last moments of lucidity. And, in a whisper clinging to hope, he thought of his family, his friends, and the world beyond the prison walls. Yet the inner struggle was fading, and the light of life began to fade from his vision. Finally, the chaos around them faded as their senses shut down. The mixture of prisoners' screams and the chaos of fighting became a distant echo. The world began to darken around them, leaving only fragments of memories of happy times, shared laughter, and dreams of freedom. The prison, in the midst of the revolt, was marked by the tragedy of resistance. As officers tried to restore order, Risky's body lay on the floor, a victim of a conflict that had begun with hope for freedom but ended in destruction. His sacrifice resonated in the hearts of the remaining prisoners, reminding them that the fight for freedom always comes at a cost. The news of his death spread quickly among the other prisoners. Risky's heroism became a symbol, a legend that encouraged others to carry on. His bravery in battle became a cry in the hearts of the prisoners, who continued to fight in his name. Despite his absence, his spirit lived on among those who had experienced his kindness and his fight for freedom. Risky's sacrifice resonated in every corner, challenging the prisoners to remember his struggle. The tears that were shed for his loss turned into promises to continue the resistance. No one would forget Risky, the young man who dared to dream and fight for a freedom that was considered impossible. Risky's memories and the blood shed in his struggle. Pankolan Prison Bun had unwittingly recorded the story of a young man who gave his life in the fight for freedom, igniting the courage of those left behind. He was not just a fallen body, but a symbol of respect, resilience and hope, a reminder that the fight for justice is never in vain. Pankolan Prison Bun, which had once echoed with cries of hopelessness, was now marked by Risky's sacrifice. His life, though tragically short, had become a potent symbol of resistance and the fight for freedom. The prisoners, in the aftermath of the violent revolt, looked upon the once imposing walls of their confinement with a new perspective, as a reminder of their shared struggle and of the young man who had given his life in the pursuit of justice. Risky's story spread beyond the prison walls. His fellow prisoners, inspired by his bravery, began to organize themselves even more. Every night in their cells, they remembered his words, "We will not let them destroy us." That promise resonated in every corner of the prison, fueling the flame of resistance. Despite the reprisals of the guards and the inhuman conditions, Risky's indomitable spirit became a driving force for the prisoners, inciting them to maintain hope for a better future. Over time, stories about Risky and his sacrifice began to leak out. Human rights activists, hearing about the brutal conditions inside the prison, spoke out, creating a network of support that pointed to the injustice suffered by the prisoners. Non-governmental organizations began to demand change, shining a light on the darkness of oppression that had reigned for so long. Risky's image, with his determination and unwavering desire for freedom, became a symbol at the protests. Although Risky was not physically present, his legacy lived on in every prisoner fighting for their freedom. His memory gladdened hearts and gave them strength to carry on. The prison, once a place of isolation and despair, slowly began to transform into a symbol of collective resistance. The prisoners knew that the fight for freedom was long and dangerous, but they refused to give up. Through his sacrifice, Risky had shown that it was possible to defy the oppressor and that hope could flourish even in the darkest of environments. As they looked to the future, they knew the road would be difficult, but they carried with them the certainty that every small act of resistance counted and that together, they could change the system that held them captive. Risky's story would inspire future generations to continue fighting for a world where freedom and justice reigned, and his spirit would live on in each of them.